Okay, good morning. Um, this video uh, is going to, really this video will end up in two parts rather than one. So this is supposed to be the video on banks in Al-Gamadi, I think is how you pronounce the author of the second reading. But it's going to be in two parts because the first part really is going to be about general discussions. I'll bring in some of the readings on just this whole concept of culture, and I'm bringing to this the entirety of my schooling and education, so both formal and informal, my experiences, beginning really as maybe to some degree as a teenager in high school. You've all probably looked at my autobiography at this point, which will clearly inform much of my attitude. But the fact that I'm 68 years old and have seen a lot will also inform that attitude. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with, I guess you could call this an outline. It's really notes that I'm going to speak to. Okay. So I guess I'm going to have to put my glasses on to read these. I generally do my videos without my glasses on. So the big question that I'll ask, and I want you to spend a minute thinking about this. Don't read forward in the outline if you can help it. So I'd like to ask this question whenever. Well, I ask this question in like when I teach the foundations course at 250. Some of you have had that. I also ask this question whenever I teach 441, which has been a few semesters now since I've taught that. Because I think too much is assumed by the term culture. So what is culture? Think about that for a minute. If you have a pen and paper handy, which I should have warned you about initially, piece of scrap paper is fine, on your computer is fine. Try to answer that for the next minute or so. I need to turn my phone down. So what is culture? Maybe pause and write some things down because I want to keep going with this. So go ahead and pause. And then after you've written a short list, or some ideas. Okay, so I'm going to go on. So we really have two cultural traditions. One's a more ancient, and it largely informed our ideas of culture until the end of the 18th century, so until the late 1700s. And that concept is paideia, as seen in encyclopedia. And it meant to be educated. Okay, it meant to be educated, to have an educated understanding of the world. It didn't refer to ethnicity or nationality group. It didn't pertain to race or class or gender. It comes out of the ancient Greeks. So automatically, academics tend to put anything that comes out of the Greeks into the Western tradition. And there's some truth to that, but much of what the Greeks believed was just as much Eastern, meaning it came out of what today we would call the Middle East. Particularly coming out not just of the Greeks, you know, of Aristotle and Plato, but also the Hellenistic period, which is post-Alexander the Great, which was centered in Asia Minor, in the Mideast, in Egypt, as far away as to what is today Iraq, into some degree Iran. So those, particularly things like the mystery religions that impacted the Greeks and then later the Romans, these were all Eastern religions, including Christianity. Okay, the influence of both Judaism and Christianity in the Roman world. Okay. So encyclopedia is originally a Greek concept. We think of it as a book. The Greeks and Latins saw encyclopedia as a process of learning about the broad-based world in order for one to engage in civil discourse and in reasonable or rational thinking. So paideia has connections to the use of reason to figure out what is fact or what is true. It's the basis of our scientific method. And what's interesting, the chief proponents of paideia in the Middle Ages was, of course, the institutions of learning, schools created by the Catholic Church, whether they were cathedral schools or monastery schools that led to the great universities of Europe. And this is the standard of culture. And in different, you know, over the course of the Middle Ages, a lot of that was centered in Paris. But just because it was centered in Paris, there wasn't a France as we know it today through much of the Middle Ages, at least until the end of the 100 Years' War, when the French finally kicked the English out of France. But even at that point, people didn't think in terms of nation groups. They thought in terms of allegiance to kings or princes. And most of these whether it was Charlemagne's empire, um, the, or the later Middle Ages, the Merovingians, even the French Empire that would come later were all multinational. So you didn't identify yourself really necessarily as French or English, or German per se. You didn't have a Germany until really the end of the 19th century. But this begins to change. The other sense of culture evolves from the writings of Johann von Herder, he's a German philosopher. He was a student of Kant's. In the late 18th century, he began this idea of identifying cultures with the folk, with a people or a language group, particularly. And one could argue that this is the beginning of this idea of equating culture with ethnicity. And today, and this was particularly dominant in Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, you had Pan-German movements, you had Pan-Slavic movements, which of course left out key groups like the Magyars in Hungary. You had these great empires in Central Europe, whether it's the Prussian, which became the German, the Austro-Hungarian, the Russian empires. Again, these were all multinational groups, but underneath that were these ideas about culture being tied to language groups. And in a sense, it was Herder's attempt to show that, well, we may think of the French over here as being this high cultural society, but us Germans, we have just as much culture as they do. We're just not as far along. So there's this cultural relativism that emerges. The first, you get a sense of this eventually with the Russians, with the Moravians in what is today the Czech Republic, the Hungarians, and so we divided ourselves along language groups and to some degree religion, Catholic versus Orthodox, through much of that too. And then the poor, the Jews were kind of left on their own. And because of their relative isolation and their persecution, emerged with their own unique culture, tied to their religious beliefs and their practices. Okay. So this is largely the idea of culture that comes out of multiculturalism, coming out of Herder's ideas, kind of updating them for political purpose. Interestingly, both the Soviets and the Nazis drew largely upon Herder's concepts of culture. And in the 20th century, to not too great effect. because with both you ended up having persecution of particular cultures that didn't align themselves properly either with the German or the Russian. Today, modern, multiculturalism talks largely about culture in terms of race, class, and gender. So, and they identify race with ethnicity to some degree, which I find interesting because at times they use that in a very modern sense, and at times they seem to use the term race in a much older sense. So at this point, what I would like you to do, is to just write a quick list, pause, and just write a quick list. And I want you to just think about the possible, the variations of possible ideas of diversity. What would you consider a diversity that a person may engage in? Okay, and I'm going to come back to culture in a second. Okay, so pause for a second and write it. And write a list. Just write until you can't think of anything else. Okay. So let me come back to the question of what is culture. Okay. So my working, you may want to call it a definition, I would rather think of it as a description, but my working description of culture is the practices that I engage in every day. Okay. That's really what culture is, I think. Now, my heritage may have some bearing on that. I would say that for me, my heritage had more bearing on that up until the time I was 18 and went into the Navy. Okay. So growing up in New Orleans. And I still have aspects of my daily practices that could be tied to New Orleans, but largely not as much as, let's say, might have been there. Even my speech. When my wife first met me, she thought I was from like New Jersey or Brooklyn because I kind of had that aspects of that Yat dialect that I may fall into now and then. But considering who I, the people I'm engaging with every day, particularly in an academic atmosphere, probably, has more influence than my history in terms of that. So, and then the other aspect of that is what part of my heritage should I most identify with? Because I'm in part Cajun, although I didn't really recognize that aspect of my heritage probably until I was in college and got involved in some of the, the Cajun language, sort of, Cajun national, a kind of Cajun nationalism, which is probably the wrong term, with Cajun music, and I knew the authors of some of the speaking Cajun textbooks and stuff. I'm also, Trish is supposedly an Alsatian. It's a derivative of an Alsatian word. It's shortened from Trishelle, we dropped the L. Supposedly we came over with the Louisiana bubble. But what happened, as best I can tell, is my forefathers that came to Louisiana over time, my branch, so all Trishas are supposedly related. My branch moved upriver. So they moved out of the German coast and into the Acadian coast. The German coast being St. Charles and St. John. We settled around Edgard, and then we moved up into St. James and Ascension and eventually Iberville. So my grandfather was born in St. Gabriel, and his wife, this is my paternal, was my grandmother was born in Plaquemine, across the river. So my grandfather and his brother would row across the river to court these two sisters. They eventually married. They were storekeepers, largely. And after they got married, they came down to New Orleans. That's where the money was, and opened up grocery stores. And actually were quite successful until the Depression. The Depression financially ruined my grandparents and their brother and sister. On the other side, my heritage is French in other ways, not Acadian, but other parts of France, Norman French, but also English. So, and we'll talk about the Englishness, and as best I can tell, and so that's my mother's father. His last name was Shepherd. That's my middle name. And the Shepherds actually would have come over as my branch of the Shepherds apparently came over on the Abigail, which is the ship right after the Mayflower. They came a little bit later, and they were apparently originally from East Anglia. So they would have been Puritans, and would eventually settle in Connecticut, and apparently help found Connecticut. So, so what do I identify in terms of heritage? And so all of those, as firm as my nature, right, my upbringing, and we'll talk about that in a second. I had varied influences. Okay. And so this is, I grant you this is a little bit of an extension of my autobiography, but I wanted to get that out first. So according to Banks, multicultural education assumes that race, ethnicity, culture, and social class are salient parts of U.S. society. It also assumes that ethnic and cultural diversity enriches the nation and increases the ways in which its citizens can perceive and solve personal and public problems. And I have I support that statement. And it's hard not to support that statement. Particularly if you understand both the dominant history and the other stories we sometimes don't tell until later. Okay. And so I will in a minute talk a little bit more about that statement in some ways. but to solve problems, all kinds of problems, whether social or technical problems, we need input from everyone. Everyone's voice needs to be heard. Okay, so coming out of the '60s, I think free speech at all levels is vital for us to solve our problems. Okay, but so all that being said, I'm going to go in a lot of this. I'm going to go back to 503, which I think everybody has either had or is having now. So I'm going to re-quote Whitehead, because we can talk about all sorts of practices in terms of diversity in classrooms. But I think Whitehead's statement that was brought out in Huebner, the Huebner piece, still holds true. And that is, where attainable knowledge could have changed the issue, ignorance has the guilt. Guilt, misspelled it, has the guilt of vice. So again, where attainable knowledge, where a student's ability to obtain knowledge could have changed their lives, right? Because the whole point of an education, if we remember, the whole point of art instruction is to improve on one's life. And this goes back to the founding of our country with the Puritans. Okay? Ignorance has the guilt of vice. Ignorance has the guilt of vice. So if our students leave us without having something that they can apply to their lives that improves their lives, okay, then shame on us as teachers. Now this, knowing Whitehead and knowing what he comes out of, this is an extension of the encyclopedic tradition. Remember Whitehead rails against the test because it's too narrowly focused. We have to know more and have to be able to apply knowledge in a broader sense. Okay. And we have to know that knowledge thoroughly, he talks about. Because once we know it thoroughly, once it becomes automatic, now we begin to see connections and we begin to apply it in a broader field. That's the idea. Okay. So our next sentence is, this raises questions like when Al-Magadi, I didn't spell that right, no way after the end, talks about what is suitable, what's a suitable educational concept. So it's, who defines that? Is that defined by best practice? But not all best practices apply to every student. All right, so remember in the Harvey article, I kind of rail against orthopractice because teachers, as they gain experience and knowledge, what I would call good teachers, aren't as interested in an orthodox practice, interested in a single method, but they're fitting what they teach to their students. Okay. So that raises one question. Now, we get hit, Hamagati hits us with this idea of the melting pot versus the salad. This is a common juxtaposition metaphor. And I don't like either one. I prefer, and this is not original with me, I prefer the idea of a gumbo. And what do you put in a gumbo? Well, almost anything, depending on the kind of gumbo and where you're from. Okay. I can't think of anything animal or vegetable. And I mean vegetable here as what we consider a true vegetable. Hasn't been put into a gumbo. I got interested when I came to Thibodeau, started working in Nichols, when I first got introduced to potato salad in the gumbo. Okay. I had never seen that before, but of course I tried it, try anything once, and it was, I liked it. And whenever I have that opportunity, I do put potato salad in my gumbo. This idea of boiled eggs. So it's which is another, I think, idea that comes out of this area, down the bayou, so to speak. And what it is just adding protein, if no other proteins available. And how is that gumbo held together? So we have difference in the different things that we put in, but it's held together by a roux, right? It's held together by a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, that commonality. So there are aspects that we share and there are aspects that are different. So I think the gumbo, in thinking about teaching diverse students, is a better metaphor than either melting pot or salad. Okay. And you may want to argue with me. So, and I think it was a good way to think about the course as we go through this. Okay. So I'm going to problematize some of this. Both, I think, both Banks and Amagata, again, I misspelled it, seem to, I would suggest or providing us with kind of ethnic blinders to think about each other. And I see this in a couple of different ways. Do we wear ethnic blinders? And I'm using ethnic here as our nature. Okay. How we come into the schools, so to speak. Do we see ourselves with these kind of ethnic blinders, which may or may not be chauvinistic? Okay. Because to whatever degree have we engaged the other? Okay, as they talk about this. So it's not until we encounter the other, which oftentimes may not be into school, just depending on our neighborhood, where we grew up, and how we see each other as the other. I'll give you one example from my life. I had an aunt who was from Mexico. I had, I'll talk about this in a minute. But I have a lot of my high school friends were either from, they were from Latin countries, whether they were Cuba or Dominican Republic or Nicaragua or Mexico. So they were all part and parcel of the high school mix. But I had an aunt from Mexico. She was from Monterey, uh, and that was part of my upbringing. So engaging with her was as natural, and engaging with those others in my high school came very naturally. Okay. Then I went in the Navy, and first time I experienced resentment that Mexican Americans had for Anglos. Okay. And it really confused me. Didn't understand it. Was not part of my experience. Okay. Um, and it took me a while to understand this. And it's also on the other side. Um, and this was in boot camp. So this was immediately into my my Navy experience, and the resentment that some of the white sailors had of Mexican Americans. A lot of distrust there, and I think we, and I think of one or two individuals in particular, and I think we kind of came to accommodation to get out of boot camp. Okay, um, and that's the one experience. I mean, I understood, as I talked about in my autobiography, if you could probably gather, the issues between white and black sailors. Although we seem to get along better. Um, and maybe that's just my memory. Um, so that may or may not have been as true. Okay. Um, but both Banks and Amagati offer up, I think, too many neat and uncomplicated categories: Anglo American, Italian American, African American, Asian American. Uh, it's interesting that Banks leaves out Asian American. Also leaves out Irish. He talks about Polish Americans. Why not Slavic? Since we have Americans, immigrants, not just from Poland, large groups from, particularly from Croatia. This is this is true in New Orleans, particularly if you eat a raw oyster, or if you eat an oyster from Louisiana, it was probably farmed by a Croatian American or somebody who's descended from these Croatian Americans. And we had a number of these kids in my school. Um, so what I'm going to do to problematize this a little bit, to give you a little more complex view, is to talk about, well, what does it mean to be an Anglo-American? Okay. And there's a history here that you can read about. And the book, I kind of went backwards on this. So the book is Albion Seed. The author of that is a historian, actually a Jewish historian by the name of David Hackett Fisher. And he, as best I can tell, he was probably grew up in New York. He was a Northeastern Jew, understood the Jewish world from that cultural context. Then he ended up teaching at Brandeis, which of course is a Jewish university. And to his surprise, he met Jewish students that were not from the Northeast. They were from the South. They were from the West. He had Jewish students that which, male students that wore cowboy hats and cowboy boots, right? From the South. They probably had their own unique cultural practices that were more identifiable with the South than with anything he understood to be Jewishness. And yet these were all Jews. Okay. And so this raised questions, enough questions in him that he wanted to study. Well, where do these folkways come from? How do these develop? Maybe we're not all as the same in the sense that we think we are. And so what he wrote, what Albion Seed is about is a result of that investigation. And what he does, he writes about what he calls the 4 dominant folkways in the United States. And he identifies these 4 dominant folkways with different parts of England. Okay, so right away we can begin to understand, and you can look up this, and I'm sure there's some short things on the internet you can read about. It's a pretty big book, and it has a huge appendix. He was supposed to be the first 3 volumes. He never finished. In the appendix, he involves some of the ideas of the other volumes. And so the 4 dominant folkways come from East Anglia, part of my ancestry. And these were the Puritans by and large. There were the Puritans from other parts of England, but the Puritan culture, or Puritan folkways, really centered around East Anglia and Cambridge University. Okay, Harvey. Okay, we go back to Harvey with some of that. The second one is the Midlands. Okay, in England, and so that's that area between London and, let's say it's the area, between London and Scotland, or the borderlands of Scotland, because we'll get to them in a second. And that group, in terms of who settled America, the colonies, right, the New World, were the Quakers. Okay, so the Quakers by and large came out of the Midlands. Now I have a cousin who argues that the Shepherds came out of the Midlands, but she's never sent me that evidence, so I wonder about that. So we have two of the dominant folkways. So the Puritans settled in New England, following the Pilgrims, who were Puritans. Okay, they were just even a little more radical than the Puritans that came over, who were all separatists anyway, meaning they wanted to separate from the Church of England. You Quakers who settled in the Delaware Valley, so either side of the Delaware River, Pennsylvania and Western New Jersey. And then you had the third dominant group is what might be called the Cavalier culture. So this came from southern England, from Sussex and Wessex, this whole line, and they settled in the tidelands of the South, the tidelands of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, particularly. And they call them the Cavalier culture because these were the monarchists. They supported the king. So you began to see many of them come to the New World following Cromwell and the Civil War between the Puritans and the monarchists. So they wanted to escape that Puritan persecution, if you will. We don't ever talk about that too much in our American history books. Just like the Puritans were trying to escape persecution from the king and the Church of England. And so they settled the coastal South, and that's and we recognize that as the kind of plantation culture, although that's not only true, because many of these people would move towards the frontier. Okay, and so all three of these groups would eventually move to the frontier, but we had to make the frontier safe, if you will. And we had, and all these were somewhat early migrations. Um, all of these came in the 17th century, so the 1600s. You also get both, the Maryland colony, which are Catholic, the rest of the Tidelands, or Episcopalian, Anglican, if you will. But the poorer people that would come over might tend to be more Baptist. Okay, so religion plays an important role here about who goes where. Because if you're Catholic or Anglican or Baptist, you did not want to go to New England at the time. And to some degree, that's also true of the Quakers. Okay. So you found other places, although they were more open. So you'd find other places to go where your people were. Okay, it makes sense. The final group were what we typically call Scotch Irish, which were not really that Scottish or that Irish, but they were from what is called the borderlands between northern England and Scotland. Many of these were, some of these were Catholic, some of these were Protestant. They rebelled against the crown. They supported the Scottish rebellions against, resistance to becoming part of Britain, if you will. Many of them, the English tried to figure out what they wanted to do with these people. They would confiscate their lands, and initially they sent them to Northern Ireland. Thus, we get the Irish problems that we've had this century between the Catholic Irish and the Protestant Irish in Northern Ireland. But then eventually, many of these people, they still were troublemakers, were sent to the Americas. And when they got here, we had no place to really put them except in the frontier. Now, this was okay, I think, because of the folkways around liberty that these borderlanders had. They resisted authority. They would not have fit in well with the kind of local governments in particularly in New England, definitely not in the Delaware Valley, but not even the Tidelanders. And so they were sent to the Alleghenies, right? They were sent west. So they would go into the Alleghenies, go into Appalachia. This is what would become, we might want to call hillbilly culture in the U.S. It's still very much present. This was fierce liberty ways, comfortable with living in isolation, didn't want to live in community per se. They would carve out a little bottomland and a river valley, and their next neighbor might have been in a river valley, and it was difficult next door, just to the north or to the south or to the east or the west, and they didn't see much of each other. There weren't a lot of towns. This is, this is the background of someone like Andrew Jackson. His family came out of the borderlands, fiercely rebellious, fiercely independent. These are the people in the Revolution when the British decided to begin their Southern strategy, weren't counting on these the so-called Scotch Irish and the kinds of resistance that they put up to the British, and created. And one of the reasons why the Southern strategy failed, along with the French fleet. But anyway, so to say Anglo culture is, well, what culture? Because Fisher's thesis is that these four dominant folkways carry on to today largely. Okay, no matter who moved into New England, right, over time, and now we're beginning to talk about the Irish and Italian, maybe some Slavic immigrants, Jewish immigrants, as they moved into New England. They took on these folkways largely. Okay, that's his thesis, and he provides evidence for this. The way they think about education, the way they think about politics, the way they think about marriage. After a generation or two, seem to fall in line. The same with the Midlands culture. As they moved into Philadelphia and in and around the Delaware Valley, they would hold on to many of the folkways of the Quakers. One of the reasons for this is a lot of the Germans that came over were considered pietists. And so their religious beliefs were very close to the Quaker beliefs. Okay. So this largely plays a role in the kind of assimilation, if we want to call it assimilation. But it would take a generation or two. And then the same, you didn't have a lot of early immigration into the Tideland South. So you would have some. Charleston would be one area, because you didn't have large cities in North Carolina or even Virginia until later. But Charleston would have been one. But Charleston, and so if an urban population that would evolve, and you may have immigrants coming there. Of course, you had these same immigrants came into the South through New Orleans. And whether they were German or Italian, a lot of farmers, Irish were laborers, they had large Irish. In fact, the first Irish Catholic church is St. Patrick's in New Orleans, in the United States. So, and so while New Orleans and Louisiana would have been somewhat different, but you see, I mean, we have over time we have unique. Let's just say we know this from cuisine, right? We have unique Creole Italian cuisines that are different from, let's say, the Italian cuisines in New York City or even in Boston. So where you had large Italian populations. And so we see obviously the beginnings of the more modern immigration at the ends, in the later 19th century into the 20th century, with fewer French and fewer English, fewer you had the Irish who were Catholic, and the disdain that Americans might have had for the Irish coming in was a holdover from the resentment of the Borderlanders and their connection with the Irish. So a lot of some of this, followed through, but there, to speak of an Anglo-American culture ignores the history, and in a couple of weeks, you'll be reading some things on whiteness and who was considered white. Some of this will come back up in terms of that, and to some degree problematizes. Now, for my own autobiography, well, let me say this: one of the big problems in the 19th century with immigration was many, whether they were Polish or Croatian, they were Italian or Irish, Germans to some degree. These people were Catholic. And so there's a lot of anti-Catholic resentment. And if any of you ever saw the Gangs of New York, you have this kind of Americanist, nativist groups being represented by the Daniel Day-Lewis character against the Irish. And so you have this. So you do have this tension. Again, I think, by the Second World War, much of this disappears. Issues with the Italians, similar things. Much of this begins to disappear. My own, and the argument's been made that the anti-Catholicism wanes, particularly with the election of John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic president. But I would argue that anti-Catholicism kind of resurfaces in the 2000s. But in its origins, I think, comes out of the residual anti-Catholic Catholicism born by Puritan culture, particularly. And I'm oversimplifying that. So, I went to school with all these people. Croatians, meaning Slavic, and African Americans, Latin, as I mentioned, Irish, Italian, German, I don't know, I guess I would be the French. We had people that were clearly Anglo-Americans, depending on what neighborhood you were from. But what was interesting is across those diversities, particularly in across all these diverse students, we all, maybe it's because we're largely Catholic, that we all shared the same types of family values, values for hard work, values for education. Some maybe not so much, but most we did. Values in terms of courtship. We dated each other's sisters and neighbors, if you will. So, I dated Italian girls and French girls and think I dated a Croatian girl, a German, of these heritages. Um, I think about half of my class. So I went technically I went to two schools, but it's all the same school. And so I graduated from Brother Martin, but I began with St. Aloysius. And Brother Martin was a combination of St. Aloysius and Karizu, two very different schools. Aloysius was much more working class. But about half of us graduated from would eventually I'd say graduated from college, or at least had substantial college in our background. The other half worked in the trades, worked in family businesses. So many of us became professional middle class. I don't know of anyone that is extremely wealthy from that group. Maybe one doctor, but I'm not. I don't know. By this point, being 68, we're gonna have our 50th reunion this summer. So it's been 50 years. I graduated in 71. It's hard to imagine. A large number of our classes has passed away. So maybe 100, I think it might be close to 100 out of 400. A quarter of our class has already died. But even today, those of us that are connected through social media, most of us share very similar values. Most of us have large families. Large for today, 3 or 4 children. Some of us have grandchildren. Some of us, like me, doesn't. Most of us are still working. Some have retired. So the emphasis here I want to make is on shared values. And what I find is we all tend to seem to have these shared values. Okay. I'm going to end this. So the one differentiation is what we haven't talked about is ability. Banks seems to minimize or ignore students with varying ability as part of the equation. Amagati, again, I misspelled the word, his name. He appears to lead with this. And I think this is important. We have a whole area, we'll read a little bit about this in the hybridity section on disability studies and its relationship to cyborgism. And I think this is a growing area of work, something we should think about. I'll get into that more. Okay, so I'm gonna, but ability. While this class, we don't get into that to a great extent. Not all disabilities, but a lot of student disability, I think is related to poverty and the importance, and I really see poverty as an important area to think about. So I'll stop sharing this. This has gone on way too long, unfortunately. And I'll have a second video more on banks in Allegati's piece. Thank you.